Hey, so in this video, what I'm going to break down for you is how we can look to the authoritarian playbook that administrations like the Trump administration are clearly operating from. The psychology as well really sort of linked to that. What that means for us in our day-to-day lives. So it's looking at that structure, that story, that psychology, applying the principles from history and looking at, well, what is it that we can do? How do we find power at a time like this? And it history is there to really lay all of that out for us. So I'm going to start out by giving you an outline of a story of a specific individual from history who is relevant to this. I'm going to show how that applies to the kind of modern manifestations of authoritarianism and what that means for us. So let's dive in. So, firstly, I want to tell you the story of a man called Hans Litten. So, Hans Litten was a German Jewish defense lawyer who, in 1931, famously put Adolf Hitler on the stand in a courtroom. This was because the Nazi Party, and I think Hitler was specifically linked to this incident, where the Nazi Party carried out an attack on a meeting held by opponents. So it was like a left wing meeting, and Hitler and his thugs broke in and beat everybody up. So Hans Litten was defending those individuals and bringing Hitler to account. And what he was unpacking with this process was saying that because at the time Hitler was trying to project an image of being legitimate. So if it became clear to the wider public that actually what he was engaging in was violence and coercion, that would have undermined his political credibility. So Hans Litten, in his cross examination, was laying out for everybody to see that this was not somebody who was a legitimate political um, presence, that he was resorting to violence, and that was the way that he was trying to gain influence. So it was important because it was making the point that this is actually not what people think it is. At that time, in 1931, Hitler did have a level of power. He wasn't yet chancellor, but he had enough influence to really kind of intimidate somebody like Hans Litten. So anyway, Hans just dismantled Hitler on the stand, and Hitler was so angry and filled with hatred for Hans Litten. He felt humiliated, he felt exposed, he felt like he was undermined. It was all of the things. It's like prick a fragile ego, and this is what happens. And as I'm talking through this story, you're going to see all sorts of parallels around the kinds of behaviour that we're seeing today. So Hitler was mad, he was angry. Fast forward to 1933, Hitler becomes Chancellor. The night of the Reichstag fire, he has Hans Litten arrested, and he puts Litten in jail. Essentially, he sends him to a labour camp where he lives out the rest of his life, having a pretty horrible time. He is forced into hard labour, he is tortured, he ends up walking with crutches by the end. And it said, I mean, the official line is that he took his own life, but he died in prison. There's no real way of knowing. This can be taken as a cautionary tale. This is Hitler saying, this is what happens to people who defy me. This is what happens to people who want to speak up and think that they can make a difference. But you are wrong. You should be afraid, because this is what I do to people who try to hold me to account. Now, he remained angry about Hans Litten for the rest of his life. And you can argue whilst the circumstances of Hitler were clear at the end, that he took his own life in a bunker in Berlin, while the wolves were at the door, he was cornered. But I have a theory that his cowardice, his fragile ego, were all at play when he was most fearful about the prospect of being held accountable. That idea was so abhorrent to him that he just couldn't face it. So the impact of Hans Litten was that it demonstrates how much Hitler would do anything to avoid accountability, and how he would try to maintain control in any way that he could while he had any sort of influence. Now, my kind of lens on this is also relevant to concepts of power and control. So, power is really something bigger than ourselves. We think of the word power and we might kind of think of male authority, male networks. It feels like it's something about maleness. Power is meant to be a male kind of domain. But actually, what we see from history is that real power is about collective action, which is led by values. So some of the most kind of effective examples of that are where you see communities or groups who are persecuted, but they find power in their connections, their storytelling, their ability to create a movement, a wave which is bigger than them. You take, for example, the call and response traditions from African heritage, which are clear throughout African American heritage through hip hop, gospel, jazz. It's something which is more powerful than the individual, and it moves through, just like the traditions of indigenous populations the world over who have faced oppression, genocide, the prospect of being wiped out. But where they find power is through the ongoing legacy, storytelling, the collective values that people have, which are bigger than any one person. So that is power, that is true power. What authoritarianism is about is control. It's small minds engaged in small acts to try to maintain control. Now, Hannah Arendt, who was one of the great philosophers of the 20th century, was a presence in the trials after the Second World War, and she saw firsthand a character called Adolf Eichmann, who had really been the bureaucrat behind the processes around the Holocaust. And what struck her was how banal this man was, how he was so ordinary. And what that demonstrated was the kind of the smallness, the small-mindedness of just following orders, doing what you're told, going with the expectations. It's conforming to what is expected. So Adolf Eichmann is the other side of the coin to somebody like Hans Litten. Adolf Eichmann was being controlled. Hans Litten was demonstrating power. So coming back to the story of Hans Litten and Adolf Hitler, there is something very clear about how this kind of fragile ego will do anything to avoid accountability. They will avoid any sort of what they believe to be personal humiliation, and they will lash out and they will try to make an example of people that shine a light on that. So we see this playing out very clearly with Trump. This is the approach that he is taking. He is a small mind trying to maintain control with small actions by cancelling TV shows or bringing cases, like trying to sue his opponents. It's not it's not masterful, it's not clever. It's it's whack-a-mole. It's trying to stop these different aspects. Now, the reason why that is so illustrative is because it shows the difference between small minds trying to control individual instances as opposed to a movement which is bigger than any single person, which will continue through shared enterprise, storytelling, generational trauma and experience. So this all applies in terms of, well, what do we do? Well, what can we do about this? What we can do is, at the point where we see that he is unraveling in this way, we double down, because the more that he tries to control, the more it becomes clear that he cannot control everything. He cannot control us, our thoughts, our relationships, our networks. That's why he tried to ban Maya Angelou. That's why the far right always turn to the smallness of trying to push away the big ideas, because it's focusing on what's the threat. You should be afraid. You should be worried about what I'm going to do to you. Well, how about the fact that you're unraveling is a sign that you're the one who's breaking, that you're the fragile ego, because that is what we are seeing. And whilst it can be an effective tool for people to see, okay, you step out of line, you speak up, this is what will happen, which we saw in the Second World War clearly, it is clear that there is an impact to it. And so we can learn from history that these personalities are really dependent on how they are perceived. That is their whole MO, if you like. It's about perception, it's about how they are perceived. And if that shifts, if that changes, then they lose everything, because what they are demonstrating isn't real. Authoritarianism is only real because it uses violence and control. If it wasn't for violence and control, it would just be an idea. But it's the real life threat that is an effective way to paralyze people, because that's how fear works. But if we can intellectualize it, look at history and put it into context and say, this is actually a sign of somebody losing control, then it gives us more strength to work together, back each other up, and double down on the things that we are saying. It makes us more likely to speak out and come together, because the more of us that do it, the harder it is for them to play whack-a-mole. I mean, you can just break it down to, maths. So keep doing what you're doing. If you want to look at how you can use it, it is simply about using your voice, being free. What can be helpful in these times is a reality check. So we look to somebody like Hans Litten, and that is a terrifying story. It's almost like a cautionary tale. But Hans Litten couldn't have known how history would play out. He couldn't have predicted the Second World War. But what he could do was see what was happening in that moment. And I tell you one thing, if there had been more Hans Littens, would we have even got to that point? Because there's something very real about individuals not being held to account and continuing to engage in these behaviours simply because nobody felt it was their responsibility. But if we remember that power is collective, then it is everybody's responsibility. And we have each other to support and protect one another, just in the same way that neighbours are looking out for their community in the United States if ICE agents descend. We do this already. This is a way that we survive. But what is helpful is checking in with what is at play. They are using fear and intimidation. That's classic. That's classic, authoritarian playbook. But what's classic for us is supporting one another, using our voices, telling stories, being able to stay true to our values, because they don't understand that. That's like it's like speaking another language. If you're able to have integrity and stay with your values, that's like a complete superpower to people who have no concept of things like empathy or integrity. It baffles them. That's our strength. That's what works. So let's reality check, right? That's the thing. Fear is the tool. What do we really have to fear? What do we really have to fear? We have more to fear if we don't hold individuals and systems to account than if we actually use our voices. You are at risk either way. The threat remains either way. How are you going to rise to the challenge? We don't all have to be a Hans Litten, but what we can be is a force of our own values. If we live our own values, we don't even think about it. We don't even need to think about it, because the individuals who don't play by the rules, who think they can control, will be held accountable. And we can do it in ordinary lives. That's the power that we have, is speaking up and holding individuals and systems to account. That's what true power is. So I want to hear more thoughts on this. I think it's really important. I think now more than ever, we need to be crystal clear about what we need to do. And I really feel strongly that this is the point in time where we double down. Because the more they try to impact on individuals, when they try to do things like silence free speech, when they use intimidation, when they use violence, that's when they're losing control. And that is where we are at our most effective. So let's do it.